So welcome, or for some of you, welcome back to Dalhousie's Open Dialogue series. And what a glorious day to be getting a chance to get caught up on some of the most burning topics of our times. I'm Kim Brooks, Dean of the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie, and I'm very excited to welcome you to today's conversation with Katherine Fierlbeck and Dr. Larry Turnbull. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a variety of topics, all of them gripping. Democratic governance and public health emergencies, how political institutions have responded to COVID, government accountability, the role of the opposition, and what the politics of recovery look like. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Katherine Fierlbeck. She's the McCulloch Professor of Political Science in Dalhousie's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and Dr. Larry Turnbull, the Director of Dalhousie's School of Public Administration. And we're going to turn our minds to policy, politics, and the pandemic. During the presentations, I'd encourage you to post your questions online. This is a great chance to hear from some of the most talented thinkers in our country on these topics. And later in the program, we're going to open up the discussion and we'll ask some of those questions to the presenters. So let me turn the stage over to Dr. Katherine Fierlbeck, who will start off the conversation.
Thanks, Kim. So the discussion over COVID-19 is generally framed as a medical issue. How contagious is it? How severe is it? When will we ever have that vaccine? When in fact, it's just as much, if not more, a political issue. Now, this is certainly true in the 14th century, where the medical understanding of the bubonic plague at the time was sketchy at best. Do we have any slides here? But even in the 14th century, it was clear to those at the time that certain political systems were much better than others at containing the disease. And history gives us countless examples of this. So the cities of Milan and Mantua, for example, were quite effective at establishing a cordon sanitaire around their cities, despite the protests of the merchants who, then as now, saw physical containment as an irritating interference with the circulation of commerce. In Milan in the middle of the 1500s, for example, the disinfecting of about 9,000 rooms in the city and the costs of feeding and relocating those under quarantine apparently emptied the city coffers in 4 days, which displeased the taxpayers of the city quite considerably. Now, the reason that some jurisdictions are so successful, and were successful at the time in containing the plague, of course, is because they were ruled by tyrants. So in Venice, for example, where the Pope actually excommunicated all of the city's health officers for shutting down church services, the powerful Doge fully supported his health officers, whose powers to enforce emergency measures included both arrest and torture. The same was true for the border between the Habsburg and the Ottoman empires in the 18th century. The military border also served as a 1,900-kilometer-long cordon sanitaire. And interestingly, the quarantine period for anybody crossing the border was normally about 21 days, although this increased to 84 days where there were reports of plague in the vicinity. Anybody not respecting the quarantine was shot. So this rather puts things in perspective, I think. But the point here is that effective pandemic management at the time depended upon a strong autocratic order that was not particularly beholden to commercial or religious or any particular interest at all. The dynamics of pandemic management in democratic systems, though, as we've recently seen, are far more complicated. For if a state rules on behalf of the people themselves must ultimately sanction the measure that they may find intolerably restrictive. So there's a delicate balance here between effective political rule needed to address the spread of disease on the one hand and the transparency and accountability required for democratic states to function on the other. Now, in more open systems, as theorists from Bentham to Foucault have observed, the social gaze turns on itself. People police each other and themselves far more effectively than any tyrant could. So here on the slide, we have a version of Bentham's panopticon, where everybody is always watched by everybody else. But the question we now have is this social policing a desirable thing or not? Now, during emergencies, people tend to focus on leaders rather than laws. And most leaders, unless they really drop the ball, tend to experience a considerable bump in popularity. So as you can see by these two polls, premiers Ford and McNeil especially have found themselves over 30 points higher in popularity than they were in the fall. So we listen to our leaders in the midst of a crisis, but at the same time, do we scrutinize the laws? And in fact, how many people actually know what the emergency legislation for Nova Scotia is? Well, it's not actually that straightforward. So most emergency measures in Nova Scotia come under the Health Protection Act, although some measures also fall under the Emergency Management Act. Now, how many people, though, have actually read these documents? They're quite short, not too legalistic, and they're both available online. Well, the interesting thing, I think, in Nova Scotia, especially, was a discrepancy between the severity of the messaging and the leniency of the emergency measures. For example, as everybody knows, we were told to stay the blazes home, not to socialize at all, even at a distance of 2 meters or more. And yet these measures were never actually supported in law. And that's quite different from what other jurisdictions were experiencing. So, for example, in Italy, which experienced quite a strict lockdown, especially in the north, every time you left the house, you needed a certificate like this one, attesting to the reason you were not at home. And in fact, one of the reasons you could leave the house was if you owned a dog that required exercise. So there was quite an illicit practice of borrowing dogs, so to allow people to leave their apartments. And I think there were probably a lot of happy dogs as well. In Ireland, you were confined to a radius of 2 kilometers from your house, though I think that has more recently been expanded to 5 kilometers from your home. And again, in many Canadian provinces, all non-essential businesses were shut down, although not in Nova Scotia. However, many businesses in Nova Scotia shut down voluntarily for lack of customers because people were staying the blazes home, which again, they were never legally obliged to do. Now, not only were our leaders telling us to do things that we were not legally required to do, but their social messaging also supported the idea that certain activities were prescribed when again they were not. I find this particular graphic very interesting. So here we have a list of rules, some of which are in fact legally sanctioned and some of which are not. Somewhat confusingly, some of these activities were disallowed under orders authorized by the Health Protection Act, others by the Emergency Management Act, and others were never formally disallowed at all. So if you look on the left-hand side, municipal parks and beaches were closed under the Emergency Management Act. Golf courses were closed under the Health Protection Act. And going to the cottage and visiting gardening centers were never actually prohibited at all. So if you see on the right-hand side, we were enjoined to remember to follow the rules, although it was highly unclear whether rules meant laws that you could be fined for ignoring or simply just sensible practices that one would be wise to follow, sort of like don't touch your face. Yet at the start of the period of emergency management of the province, I think people were very stressed out about what they could and couldn't do. People were quite worried, for example, that the police would stop their cars and demand to know where they were going and why. And yet when people tried to ask for clarification on these points, they were excoriated for trying to find loopholes. So paradoxically, then, while clarity and precision are normally hallmarks of good laws and good democracies, it was precisely legal ambiguity and political misdirection that allowed us to maintain substantive liberties throughout the pandemic. So the case could be made that in Nova Scotia, at least, the less we understood the laws, the better the laws served us and what they were designed to do. Now, when I ask my students whether Jean-Jacques Rousseau was correct to say that a legislator in a democracy could legitimately trick or manipulate gullible citizens for the sake of the common good, my students are generally aghast, if not outraged, which is actually a good thing. And when I ask them whether it's true, as Tocqueville has observed, that we may have more to fear from each other than from the state, they say, oh yes, people must be free to stand up to majority sentiment. And yet, democratic governance in a condition of serious health risks, limited empirical information, and a constantly changing understanding of what we're facing, I think makes us realize that these aspirational platitudes about democracy may be a lot more complex than we appreciate. Getting people to do the right thing is always a difficult problem in democratic states at the best of times. And emergency measures only compound the issue. But at the very least, I think we should appreciate that the costs and trade-offs involved in pandemic management are not only economic, they may be political as well. Thanks.
Katherine, that was great. It gave me lots of questions, so I hope people are taking a moment to record the things that they would like to make sure we get a chance to ask you at the end. And I hope they record lots of questions, but leave a little bit of room so I can ask a couple of follow-ups. And it's a nice part of this series because, one of the last sessions I had the joy of facilitating, there was it was a discussion about where we're getting the truth as part of this era. And I really see some connections between the points you've made and some of the points made by speakers in that previous panel. So thank you. All right, now's the chance for me to introduce Dr. Larry Turnbull, and I'll ask her to provide us with a few of her starting thoughts. And again, I'll encourage people while Laurie's talking to think a little bit about what questions you might have for her or ones that bridge both of the panelists' remarks. Over to you, Laurie.
Okay, thanks very much, Kim. And thank you, Katherine. That was so informative. And I'm so jealous that you have such a lovely slideshow because I don't have anything quite that good or that entertaining or any deck really. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the political consequences of COVID-19 and how our political institutions have responded and what we might think is coming up in terms of once we're able to move past the acute public health crisis and get into a more planned reopening of the economy, of business, of public institutions, what that's going to look like and how our political institutions are able to respond to that. So I think initially, the decision to close up and to really respond, very quickly to containing COVID-19, that's a decision that seemed to develop very, very quickly over a short period of time. All of a sudden, you were walking down the street and businesses were closed, schools were closing, universities were moving online, Parliament wasn't going to meet anymore. And I think people didn't have a whole lot of, people were a little bit caught off guard by that. And immediately we were thrust into this situation where, as Katherine explained, governments were able to really control our behavior and control the way that we related to one another and interacted with one another or didn't. We immediately started seeing a lot of our Prime Minister, and that depending on whether you tune into these things or not, you can see the Prime Minister pretty well every day. He gives daily briefings from his Rideau cottage. And so he usually does these press conferences alone, and he often uses the time to draw attention to what the government wants us to do in terms of containing the spread of COVID-19. He often uses this time to make announcements about public benefits packages, things that the government is going to do for individuals, for workers, for businesses, and kind of justification for why the government is doing these things. He usually includes some positive messaging around, this is temporary. We have to take these measures to protect each other. We are going to get through it. Things will get better. And so then the camera kind of leaves the Prime Minister and goes over to often to a cabinet committee chaired by Chrystia Freeland. And that committee tends to do the briefings with Dr. Theresa Tam, where we get kind of a more detailed account of how we're doing in terms of the numbers, what specific public health measures we should be taking in order to be safe. And we get more detail on the government's response. And so on some level, we're seeing a lot of transparency in some ways around the executive response. We have a lot of FaceTime with the Prime Minister. However, as we know, we live in a parliamentary system where Parliament holds the government to account. We have a huge responsibility placed on Parliament in terms of holding the government to account for spending. And we're seeing the government make major, unprecedented decisions about the use of taxpayers' money, how to support businesses and individuals, the implementation steps for how to roll out support programs. We're seeing those things happen at a time when Parliament is not completely closed, but it is taken a very different form. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is an increase in the media accountability for the executive and a little bit of a downplaying of the parliamentary accountability, because they're not meeting as often. Meetings are sometimes in person between 40 or 50 people. Everybody else is joining in remotely. And then sometimes the meetings are entirely virtual. And up until recently, these meetings have been, like, accountability for ministers has been restricted to things that are related to the COVID response. Only recently have MPs been able to open it up to ask questions of ministers that aren't entirely related to COVID. And so the whole relationship between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the executive on the one hand, and Parliament on the other hand, has really been transformed by the realities of COVID and the fact that Parliament hasn't been able to meet as a group as it normally would. And I mean, because it's not just the 308 MPs that would be going to the House of Commons, it's all the staff and custodians and security and all, people who work at the Library of Parliament. There are thousands of people on Parliament Hill when it operates. And so the logistics around making Parliament work in COVID have really been a bit complicated. And when we've seen these things move online, we are exposed immediately to some of the realities that many of us face, right? Connectivity issues. We see MPs like they're dropping off. They have to try to rejoin the meeting. They're getting frustrated. They're unintentionally muting themselves. The speaker has to call that out. And so it's like we see parliamentarians in some ways grappling with the same kinds of considerations that we're grappling with and trying to figure out how to make it work. Trying to manage the logistics of doing your job from home at the same time as you're looking after your children, you're looking after your spouse, the work-life balance is thrown into chaos in some ways during the COVID period. And we're seeing MPs and the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers react under those conditions as well. I think in some ways, for a period of time, we were really questioning what the role of the opposition is during an emergency. Right. And Katherine's presentation made reference to some of the kind of the popularity around executives during a crisis like this. We usually see, if there's a crisis, if it's whatever kind of crisis it is, if there's some sort of disaster or emergency that the government has to respond to, it usually does coincide with an elevation in popularity. That won't last. And it's kind of neither good nor bad, I guess, or both. It's just something that happens when I think we need the government to be extremely decisive on something, and we see the government being decisive, and the messaging is all around the public interest and keeping us safe. And there's almost a need for more support for the government at this time, because governments are making these huge decisions that impact us so fundamentally, and will for a long, long time. This is transformative. It would be hard for the government to carry things out, whether it's economic benefits or it's social distancing regulations, if public trust was in question, right? So if you had the opposition all the while, really kind of taking the government to task for every decision it makes and really, holding the government's feet to the fire, there could be some potentially negative consequences for the trust, the social trust, the public trust that we need in order to be able to really be in this together. So I think for a while, it put the role of the opposition a bit into question. But now I think you're seeing some of that peel away and some of the partisanship is returning. And I think we'll see that intensifying as the federal Conservatives move toward their leadership contest. And I think we'll see it at the provincial level too, as we move out of, and provincially at different rates, we move out of the acute public health crisis, hopefully soon, into the phases of reopening the economy and public life. I think then we'll start to kind of take that retrospective approach where we look critically at the steps we've taken and we try to determine where we've done the right thing, where we could have learned, where we can take a lesson learned. And if we're ever in the situation again, we can do better. I think those kinds of accountability questions are going to be front and center before long. In terms of the institutions, there's also the role of the public service that I think has really been front and center in the conversations around Canada's response to COVID-19. Sometimes the public service is criticized for being too slow, for being not responsive enough, to being not so much in keeping with what people want. Its solutions tend to be very broad-based and not specific to any group, and then that creates problems in terms of their effectiveness. But I think for the most part, there's been a lot of positive messaging around provincial governments and federal governments' responses to COVID-19. We've seen the federal government respond very swiftly in terms of getting aid to businesses, getting payments, cash flow to individuals, and taking steps to try to mitigate the wreckage to the economy. And so I think that's going to create a bit of an elevated expectation for the public service going forward. People are going to say, listen, that time that we were in real trouble with COVID-19, you guys came out with a response within a week. And so, we had money in our account within a week. So clearly you're able to be fast and responsive when you want to. So when are we going to see more of that, right? And how are we going to move the culture of the public service to be a bit more innovative, a bit more comfortable with risk now that we've gone through this, and the concept of what the public service can do for people is different. So there's that. At the same time, I think we could be in a situation where, eventually we're going to have that nasty conversation about how we're going to pay for all this. How are we going to pay for the CERB payments? What are we going to do to be able to reinforce the economy? What kind of continuous support are people going to need? Are businesses going to need? How are we going to help the businesses who don't make it? This is going to have an enormous, enormous cost to it, obviously. And so at a time where we're seeing the public service arguably perform at its best, are we also going to be talking about a smaller public service? Are there going to be ways that the public service is going to be, are we going to see some major program reviews to try to reduce the public cost of running the public service so that we're able to redirect more of those funds to other programs? And so I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm just saying that's going to be part of the conversation for sure. And possibly we might be having that conversation in the middle of a federal election campaign sometime soon, where the parties may find it useful or advantageous or desirable in some way to go to the public to say this, and these are the different ways that we think we should respond to COVID-19. Now, what do you think? And given the current federal government's minority position, I wouldn't be surprised if the Liberals want to move toward an election at some point in the next year to try to turn that into a majority, to be able to go forward with their campaign with their plans to rehabilitate on their own. And I think if the Conservatives want to generate some positive buzz around the new leader, they may see an advantage to going to an election as well. So before I run out of time, just to step away a little bit from those institutional concerns and the political concerns around what's going on right now, then there's a broader question of what is reopening going to look like when we look at it in a much more medium to long-term way? And how are we going to make sure that we're not just returning to some kind of normal that we had before, but how do we really leverage the experience of COVID-19 as a kind of flashlight on problems that we have and we've had for a while? So not necessarily, reinventing absolutely everything, right? There are going to be some things that people absolutely want to go back to what we think is normal. But there are going to be things that, if we really want to look this in the eye and be truthful with ourselves, there are problems, there are systemic problems that we have to fix that have come to light in the COVID-19 experience. We know that there are vulnerable populations here. We know that the spread of COVID-19, the realities, the health outcomes of COVID-19 are different if you're Black as opposed to white. And we cannot, no reopening is going to be seen as successful, comprehensive, fair, equitable, if we're not able to address those realities and move forward on them. And one thing about being in isolation, as we all kind of are to varying degrees, I guess, depending on what province you're in, it does give you a lot of time to think. And so I think one of the things that we're going to take from this is a lot of mindfulness, whether we wanted it or not, and opportunities for people who do work on these issues to think about ways in which we can create a much more equitable society and set of circumstances going forward. So I'll leave it there just so that I don't talk too long, because it's annoying to listen to somebody talk and talk and talk when you want to ask a question. And so thank you very much to everybody for attending today and for listening. And I look forward to the discussion part.
Laurie and Katherine, that was great. It was almost like you'd perfectly designed them
of course we did.
Ordering and the context. So we'll give people a minute to type in the questions that they have, and as those are ready, they'll appear on the bottom of the screen, and I'll read them out so that everybody's able to hear them. And then Katherine and Laurie, you can decide between the two of you whether you both want to respond or whether it seems more suitable for one of you. So here's from Kevin. Opposition leaders seem to be walking a fine line between not muddying the public health message and carrying out their adversarial role in our system of government. What have opposition leaders done well, and what have they not done well? Maybe I'll start by throwing that to you, Laurie, since there was an explicit part of your talk that dealt with that. So we'll throw it to you and then see if Katherine wants to add anything in.
Sure, and I'll just give two examples. I think something that the opposition parties federally did really well is when the Liberals had come out initially and wanted to, they put forward a proposal that would have allowed them to spend, borrow, tax without accountability on that until December 2021. The opposition parties pushed back and managed to address that. And so I think that example showed a lot of competence, a lot of, kind of unity on the part of to a certain extent, on the part of the opposition parties, and that they knew that was important. And if they lost that tool as an opposition, that would be a major problem. I think what they've done wrong, I do not understand the logic that Mr. Singh was using when he decided to make the deal he made with the Prime Minister. So in order to be able to adjourn Parliament to start again in September with only 4 meetings over the course of the summer, in exchange for that deal, Mr. Singh, the Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democratic Party, as a concession got from the Prime Minister that the Prime Minister will pressure provinces on universal sick leave. Well, that's fine, but the Prime Minister can't make that happen. He can pressure, right? And he knows he's going to get significant pushback from the provinces and also from the business community. And I would have liked to see a little bit, I would have liked to see Parliament not find a way to shut down right now, but find a way to be able to continue to have at least a hybrid version over the course of the summer, because frankly, nobody's thinking about going on vacation at this point. There's no reason they can't continue in a hybrid scenario at least a couple of days a week.
Katherine, do you want to jump in?
Just a quick note that I think it's a very interesting chance for opposition parties now to define themselves, especially for provinces which may be going into elections sooner rather than later. So, for example, in Nova Scotia, you have a tension between the business sector that wants to open up as quickly with as few restrictions as possible, but you also have a constituency of largely older people who are more vulnerable, who are going, you don't have to hurry up here, like just take your time, right? And I think the Liberals have in the past enjoyed support from both constituencies, but McNeil is walking it's a very delicate balance there. So it is a chance, say, for the Conservative Party to be able to identify a constituency and really try to win their favor by taking a very clear line on this.
Thanks. Here's a question from Charlotte. What will our government learn from the pandemic that may change the way that they operate in the future?
I can give a bit of a historical context here, since I seem to be good at that, but I won't go back to the Middle Ages here. I think it's important to remember that the way that we are dealing with COVID-19 really goes back to both the H1N1 pandemic and also SARS in 2003. And in fact, Canada was one of the few Western countries that actually had to deal with SARS. And to a certain extent, or at least the city of Toronto, was quite humiliated by it because the World Health Organization put travel restrictions, a travel advisory on Toronto, largely because the province and the federal government could not effectively communicate. So essentially, under the health regulations, international health regulations, Ottawa was supposed to inform the WHO of certain statistical indicators. And because Ontario couldn't or wouldn't communicate these stats to Ottawa. Ottawa couldn't tell the WHO, so the WHO said, well, obviously there's a problem here, so you guys, we're giving people a warning. So I think the government was quite stung by that, and that, of course, resulted eventually in the development of the Public Health Agency of Canada, which some people refer to as FAC. Be careful how you say it. And then, the new, so this was a dramatic change in the way that public health was done in Canada as a federal system. And then this was tested in 2009 when we had H1N1, because H1N1 was the first case because it was a pandemic that occurred across the country. And we learned a lot of lessons. So the lessons learned with SARS was that, okay, governments have to communicate. Just because we're a very decentralized federal country doesn't mean that the individual jurisdictions can ignore the other. So SARS put into system a form of communication in which there were a lot of bodies which were developed to allow the governments to communicate with each other. The problem is that, in a way, the lessons were learned too well, and there were far too many bodies and agencies and auxiliary committees set up to help governments communicate with each other. And it turned out there are too many bodies, too many things. And what we learned from H1N1 was that we have to define roles and responsibilities a little bit more clearly. So that was put into place post 2009. So again, the question comes, well, what have we learned with COVID-19? That's a great question. And I think as time goes on, we can learn more and more about, what we should learn. And one major, very important point that we've learned with COVID-19, you say with SARS was only hospital based. It was really only a problem of spread through hospitals. And H1N1 was, largely affected the younger people rather than the older people. So, of course, with H1N1, even though there was spread in the community, you didn't have the issue of long-term care homes that we have now. And this has been, so these community clusters, long-term care homes, prisons, meatpacking plants, we have to be aware that with a pandemic, there is a certain ecosystem where certain areas are more vulnerable than others. And in this case, because of the way it was spread, because of the asymptomatic spread, because of the severity, et cetera, we have had a real tragedy, especially in long-term care homes, that we never had with any previous modern pandemic. So, exactly how a virus spreads in a community and who's most vulnerable and how you deal with it, that's going to be the key lesson, I think, that we learned from COVID-19.
Thanks so much, Katherine. That was a great response to that question. Very nicely took us through a set of periods of time. No, you started a little ahead of that, but still, it was lovely the way you tied all those together and ending with the long-term care facilities, that Ontario report, or I guess disclosure, sure made me embarrassed that I hadn't been more attentive in the past to that issue. So maybe we'll turn to the next question. From Senja, what is your stance on Dr. Strang's stance that, here's a perfect takeoff, stance that Northwood Homes leadership did everything they possibly could based on evidence that was available at that time? I don't know if either of you have any detailed knowledge about Northwood, but if you do, I'll turn that to you.
I don't have any detailed knowledge about Northwood whatsoever. However, it does get to the question of the role of public health more broadly. And I think that the context of this question is that we don't take public health seriously unless it's too late to do anything about it. So if you talk to epidemiologists in Canada and elsewhere, they knew damn well that there is going to be another major pandemic. And in fact, if you look at the literature examining H1N1, there was an assumption that H1N1 was going to be this horrible avian flu. And the one flu that the scientists were worried about had this horrible, I think it was like a 50% mortality. And in fact, H1N1 turned out to be a bit of a damp squib. And we were lucky then. We're not so lucky now. But to the extent that epidemiologists and virologists have identified the real danger, and of course we knew about wet markets that were never shut down. So if you ask the right people, and I think this is true for the CDC in the US as well, if you ask the right people, they knew that this was coming. just as public health people are telling us that there are certain things that we should pay attention to that we don't. And the reason for that, of course, is the politics of public health, which is that, to be fair, there's so many demands on the healthcare system, especially in acute care and primary care. People don't have GPs. They're yelling at the government. The government wants to be elected. So what's going to be their main concern? The main concern is going to be get people a GP, make sure they don't have to wait in an ambulance for 5 hours, make sure that they can get a bed in a hospital or a long-term care home. So there are all these demands. So governments generally don't pay a lot of attention to larger public health issues, which is that, there are things out there that may happen that we probably should be worried about, because if something does happen, then we're really going to be sorry we didn't look at it. But just because of the way politics is configured, and especially democratic politics, there are so many burning brush fires at any given time that these things that we know about are never, there's no chance or time or manpower to be able to put them on the table and to look at them. So yes, I think there was evidence to say that long-term care homes were going to be a huge problem. But to be fair, it was just one possibility, something that might happen that decision makers had to look at in a context of a number of other pressing issues.
Great. Thanks, Katherine. That was a tough one. Okay, there's been a lot of focus with governments on the now. Do you think we're doing enough thinking and talking about the what comes next? So this jumps off a bit, Laurie, I think, from where you ended your remarks. So maybe I'll turn it to you to start on this one.
Sure. I think there's on this question, there's a kind of an imperative to focus on the now, because I think the now keeps changing to a certain extent, right? Like in terms of watching the numbers and whether the spread is contained and whether we have to keep going with the same things that we've been doing. Like, I think it's still kind of an evolving situation. And as long as we have that kind of acute public health care crisis as what we're dealing with, the focus will absolutely be on the now. But there is some thinking going on. And I think not just in government, but also in the academic community, in the business community, chambers of commerce, think tanks. Like there is a lot of thinking going on how we're going to manage this down the road. And so I think I'm confident that when this shifts from a public health crisis to a reopening, that there's going to be a lot of hitting the ground running, to be honest, on how we open up and how we get this right. And so it's not at all too early to be thinking about the how we get it right stuff, right? Because everybody doesn't have to be thinking about the now. Certain people do, but not everybody does. Many people can turn their attention to what's going to happen in 6 months, a year, 2 years.
Can I ask, I'll turn to you, Katherine, in a minute and see if you want to jump in on this one, but can I ask you a follow-up, Laurie? I'm curious about whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about what comes next. So in your remarks, you said something about, we're going to find ourselves at some point with potentially large government deficits, trying to figure out how we reconcile ourselves to the spending that took place in this era. And on the other hand, saying that there were a host of vulnerabilities in the system that got identified as part of our experience of COVID and its ramifications. They push in two different directions in some ways. Where do you land?
Yeah, I think it's always better to be optimistic, for one thing. As any optimism should trump pessimism as much as we can. But I think in the initial stages, we're going to see some of the solidarity, some of the public trust breaking down a little bit. We're seeing public trust break down globally in a way that I don't know if it's ever broken down before. And so we have a lot of work to do on trust. And that's going to be, I think, one of the hardest things to work on as we go forward. How do we get where we need to be on that? I think that we're going to see some of the federal, provincial détente that we've seen is going to erode, and we're going to see some of that partisanship flare up again very shortly. And that won't necessarily impede progress, but it will change the conversation between the Prime Minister and the Premiers and Minister Freeland and the Premiers, because a lot of what we're going to have to do in terms of rebuilding is going to be on the shoulders of the provinces and the municipalities. the feds have more of the money, but they don't have the capacity to do the kinds of things that, like, I mean, they do for some things, but a lot of what needs to be done is going to have to be done locally. And so at a time where we really need the provinces, the federal governments, Indigenous governments, municipal governments to come together and work together, that's going to be a big part of how we get this done. And I have confidence that even apart from the political accountabilities we see, even apart from the political exchanges, we have fantastic public services in Canada. We have extremely competent public services in Canada. And there are networks that are laid down that are already existing that will create cooperation between orders of government so that we can get things up and running soon.
Catherine, what do you think? Do you want in on this question, or do you want to
very quickly
spin the roulette wheel and see what comes next?
I was just reflecting when Laurie was talking. I was just reflecting that in the past few years, a really trendy word in business schools and elsewhere has been disruption. You have to think disruptively, and well, baby, you want disruption, you got disruption. And it has shown that we can do things differently and quicker, as Laurie mentioned. And for example, as a cyclist in a city, I was absolutely thrilled at how quickly planning permission was granted and plans were made and cycle corridors actually put into place. So there is a wonderful opportunity given the disruption to do things differently. I'm generally more of a pessimist, I'm afraid. And I think that a lot of the aspirational thinking is going to come to a screeching halt when the bills come in and puts a bit more of a damper on this.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. So let's see if we can take a look at another one here. All right, from Hannah. Do you think this learning moment will properly sink in to the federal government on a political or moral level? Who'd like to jump in on that first? It might be kind of interesting to see, often, Catherine, you've kind of addressed the provincial context and Laurie's addressed the federal context. So maybe I could ask each of you to jump in with that level of government in mind.
Go ahead, Laurie.
Okay, sure. The federal government, I think, yeah, there's going to be some sinking in going on for sure. And this is kind of relates to a question that was posed earlier about what government will learn from COVID-19. I think there's some important lessons being learned here about organizing work. And so going forward, I think the government is going to, there's going to be some things sink in around remote working, work-life balance, how to create proper networking, how to collaborate well, how to organize and motivate teams, how people work, how people do the best work. And so I think we've had to get to know each other in different ways as colleagues throughout this experience. And I think the federal government is going to be taking a close look at how it organizes its own workforce in ways that are able to really, get the best out of people that they can. Going forward, that could mean people want to keep working from home. They want to form teams differently. They may want to, I think we were having a conversation anyway as a country and as much more globally on the future of work and how we're going to organize all of that. And so I think this has made that an even more urgent conversation. And so I think questions around productivity, teamwork, collaboration, networking, those things are going to, the federal government is learning very important things here that it will take forward.
I really like the last part of this question, a political or a moral level. And I think, there's a positive side to this, but there's also a bit of a darker side. And the positive side, to a certain extent, again, it harks back to H1N1, when all the governments, federal and provincial, learned that they really had to think about their political messaging, and that if they didn't make an effort to be clear and to address the public clearly and consistently, then it would be very... there'd be a lot of turmoil and people would be upset because they didn't know what was happening and why things were happening differently. So the messaging, I think one good thing that they've learned is that they had to be open with the public. I really like the idea that most provinces had sessions where they would publicly give a message and then take questions from the media. And sometimes it didn't answer questions, but so be it. At least they're up there facing the firing squad. So I think that's good. The public messaging, the idea that a government has to account for what they were doing to a public in real time was a good message. However, I'm also concerned that governments, especially at a provincial level, may have a better sense of what they can get away with, which concerns me a bit more. So, for example, in Nova Scotia, we have two key bodies that serve major accountability functions essentially shut down. So the Public Accounts Committee is not meeting, the Health Committee is not meeting. I don't know why they can't meet on Zoom. We're certainly asking, 80,000 undergraduates in this province to do everything online. 9 people on a health committee cannot. I don't know why that's the case. I also wonder whether provinces are more emboldened to hide behind a technocratic shield, if you will. So in this province, for example, the chief medical officer of health, who's doing a wonderful job and just keeping things running. But at the same time, when he's asked about the epidemiological markers or the epidemiological stats that the province will use in order to open things or to change things, all he will say is that we have to watch the epidemiology. Like, what the heck does that mean? There is no such thing as the epidemiology. So I don't know why the province isn't more open about saying, well, when we hit indicator X, then Y can happen. And I think that the province, that the media or the public more generally is not pushing to get this kind of information because it is technical. So, but I think that this kind of information is quite important, and that the public should be concerned that we're not being presented with this.
Thanks. Okay, we'll take another one from the folks watching. Is the recent situation regarding the protests and BLM distracting from how we are judging our government's response to the pandemic? So the Black Lives Matter. Does it pull their feet from the fire on the pandemic as we seek to put them to the fire around issues of racism?
That's a really interesting question, because when there are a number of emergencies and disasters going on at once, how do we effectively hold anybody to account for anything when we know there's just kind of so much going on? I think we're capable of that, though. I think we are seeing members of the media, and we will see opposition parties seek to obtain accountability on all of this. And I think the disasters that we're facing right now, and the crises that we're facing right now, in a way, I think really focus people's attention on things that are extremely important. And so, not that, other things aren't important, but I think we're seeing a very focused conversation happening right now. And we're not seeing all of the kind of partisan silliness that we see sometimes when, frankly, politicians can get so distracted over things that don't really matter. That's the distracting thing, I think, is when politicians start fighting over somebody had a $16 glass of orange juice as though that's some big national crisis. I think actually now we are really zeroing in on the things that are important, and we might actually see greater accountability come out of this than we ever have before, because the governments cannot duck these questions.
Katherine, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think this is a very contextually dependent question. And I would say that if you were answering it by looking at the United States, I'd have a completely different answer than I would in Canada. So certainly federally in the US, I think that the way the modus operandi for politics is to set a dumpster fire and then distract from that dumpster fire by setting another dumpster fire somewhere else. And there is a certain malicious political strategy there. I would not say that the same thing is true in Canada, that this is a deliberate attempt by governments to distract from COVID. I think you ask any government, I'm sure they're going, oh Christ, not something else that we have to deal with. But it's come on the agenda, and I think for the most part, they're dealing with it as best they can. And again, I think the story is completely different south of the border.
So can I ask you maybe a connected question, because you both have raised these two issues, I think, together. So that last question was kind of interesting. Like I've been watching the Black Lives Matters movements in the US and in Canada and in Halifax, and they all seem intimately connected to me in the sense that the pandemic is creating conditions that are exposing vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are then exacerbated. We're in a moment where states are playing an incredibly enormous role. That comes with the good sides of protection for some, and the sort of harder sides of the coercive power of the state and the non-protective nature of it for others. Katherine, you said something about, the kind of context in Canada and the US in some ways being different. I guess, can I ask you, given all of the things that you've said so far, the two of you, about accountability of governments in the context of the province and federally, as well as the kind of public health responses, some of which in terms of the Black Lives Matter issues would be public health responses. Do you see lessons learned from the American experience? Are there things you really hope we don't see here? Are there ways in which our experience of the pandemic and the policy and politics of Canada, to go back to the title of the session, has had a distinct kind of Canadian feel to it? So lots embedded in that question. And in some ways, let me just ask you to take whatever piece of it you find interesting and use it as a chance to offer a few last comments.
Well, Kim, the Americans for the past few years have really made us look good. So to that extent, I think that there should be a certain amount of pride in the fact that we are trying to grapple with these issues. And I think that you're absolutely right, and that the questioner was right as well, that, the pandemic has really made us aware that there are structural inequalities, and that the social determinants of health have had a real impact upon who's vulnerable, who's most vulnerable to COVID and who's not. And in political science terms, it means that the whole idea of equity or health equities or health inequities are squarely on the table now, and that's a good thing. But again, it's in the heat of the moment. And the big question is that when the bills have to be paid, is it just going to be politics as usual?
Thanks, Katherine.
Yeah, that was a great question, Kim. And I was trying to find a way to do what you did, which was to speak to the extent to which the pandemic and the global attention, and particularly we're looking right now at ourselves and at the US, and the significance of the Black Lives Matter. I think we're seeing some reinforcing messaging there, in the sense that we are really at an opportunity right now where we're looking at systemic inequalities. We're looking at what's wrong with our systems. And our systems have been shaken by COVID. Some of them are getting up and running, and we rarely have the opportunity to say, okay, we're going to pretty well rip everything down because we have to. And now we're going to build a bunch of stuff back up again. And so what are we going to build the same, and what are we going to build better? And I think that's a critical conversation. And we're having it at the time where, we got to rebuild anyway. And so there's no excuse not to get it right or do the best we can. And so I'm just looking forward to making some things work better going forward.
Laurie, I love that you can never help yourself. There's always end on the optimism. You know what I'm saying?
Always.
Yeah.
Or I might as well just pack it in right now.
All right, Laurie and Katherine, let me thank you. That's all the time that we've got for today. Let me remind folks to join us again next week. That's Thursday, June 11th at 1 p.m. And we'll be talking then about how COVID-19 has had an effect on small business. I really appreciate your time and expertise, Dr. Fierlbeck and Dr. Turnbull. As well, I should thank our intrepid interpreter, Corinna, who's done a fantastic job, and also the DAL Open Dialogue team. It's been a real pleasure to get to spend this hour with you. I hope you get out and enjoy some of, if you're in Halifax at least, this nice weather. Stay well and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kim.